As our chairman was saying, my name is Melisa Diaz, and I'm developing this work together with Soncin, that you already know, Chiara, Masci, that is also in the audience, and the professor Tommaso Agasisti from Politecnico di Milano. And we want to develop a work regarding the evidence to support the development of early warning systems in primary school, mostly because we wanted to see the relationship between the student growth in primary school and future performances.
Slowly.
Okay, thank you. What is the reason for this study? As we heard also this morning from the INVALSI test, Italy has one of the highest proportion of early leavers, which means that 1 of every 10 students doesn't really finish the educational cycle of secondary school. The implementation of early warning systems proved to be effective to actually prevent the student dropout. But there are, let's say, many practical questions related with how to implement these early warning systems. The first one is how early should they be implemented? Because usually there is a trade-off between how early you implement the early warning systems and the accuracy of that system. And the second question is, what should they include? Just a portrait, for example, of the students that are more at risk, because there is also the risk, for example, of stigmatizing the student who will be labeled as an at-risk student. Regarding the first question, we also know that the evidence on the literature of early warning systems tend to focus on high school students. But there are two problems if we focus only on high school students. The first one is, as the literature says, the later the remediation, the less effective it is. And second, it has been proved that the disengagement with the school happens way before, usually between the transition from primary school to secondary school. Regarding the second question, what should these early warning systems include? We know that most of the studies who address differences in academic achievement focus on something that is the inter-individual difference. Mainly, for example, why some students perform better than others at a certain point in time. But there are little focus, let's say, on the determinants of the potential growth of the students. So what to make a student improve over time or decrease their performances over time. Even if it's noticed that improved performance in abilities across time has actually a positive influence on pupils' future achievements. With this background in mind, what we were wondering with this working paper is, first, to what extent the longitudinal changes during primary school can help identifying at-risk students at the last year of the lower secondary school, so at grade 8. And second, which then are the factors associated with the transition from proficiency to non-proficiency and vice versa. So if a student improved their performance in primary school, which are the determinants of that increase in the performance? Or if a student decreased the performance in primary school, which are the determinants of those decrease in the performance? The data that we use for this, so for the first result question, our outcome is whether the student is considered at risk or not. We define as students at risk those students that are classified in the competence levels of INVALSI 1 or 2. That means that they don't reach the minimum capabilities, let's say, for their current status. In the second research, for the second research question, we define downgrading students, how those students who decrease their performance in primary school, and upgrading students, how the students who increase their performance on primary school. Then we control for some demographic informations like the student's socioeconomic status, the gender, the nationality. Also we include some previous academic achievements, for example the school grade, so the oral grade given by the teacher, whether they attend kindergarten or not, and whether they were late or early, they had a late or early enrollment at the school. We also consider for some environmental variables, like for example, the socioeconomic status of the peers, without considering the single student, and also the peer scores in the INVALSI test. And as Mara was explaining before, we also control for the regional macro area, given the, let's say, the importance of this factor in Italy. Okay, regarding the first research question, what we did at the beginning is to run, let's say, several logistic regressions considering different potential longitudinal transitions. So we noticed that we add, for example, inside the model, a flag for students that, for example, pass from the top 40% of the distribution at grade 2 to the bottom 40% of the distribution at grade 5, and vice versa. The models increase the capacity of correctly classifying the level of risk of students at grade 8. So if we develop a model to identify students at risk, if we consider the longitudinal transition of 40%, like going from the bottom to the top, then we are more likely, for example, to identify correctly the number of students at risk. Just to make you an example, or in reading, for example, there are around 32,000 students who made the transition of downgrading. So they were, let's say, top students at grade 2, and then they decreased their performance at grade 5. And there are around 30,000% of the students that were actually upgrading. So they were at the bottom of the distribution in the standardized tests at grade 2, and they decreased their performance at grade 5. Then, of course, the larger part of the population is what we call unvarying students. So students who either always remain at the bottom, or let's say make small changes in the middle, or always remain at the top of the distribution. Descriptively, we can already observe that 41% of the students who downgrade at primary school becomes at-risk students at grade 8. So if you decrease your performance in graduate school, already you're more likely, almost descriptively, to become an at-risk student in both reading and mathematics. We also see, let's say, a positive effect on reading for the upgrading students. So if a student in the reading standardized test improve their performance between grade 2 and grade 5, they're actually at grade 8 going to be at the top part of the distribution. This, let's say, is less stable with mathematics, because usually in mathematics, the top students are the ones who remain the top students also later on. So, what we did is to build up our models, taking into consideration the longitudinal transitions and the interaction of this longitudinal transition with the score at grade 5. So what we see, for example, are, let's say, 4 typologies of students. And instead of talking about the coefficients, I'm going to just show you the graph of the interactions. So what we see is that the students who have the lowest probability of becoming at-risk students are the students who always have had a higher, let's say, performance that is quite intuitive. But the second best typology of students is actually the students who manage to increase their performance, so who manage to make a positive longitudinal transition during primary school. In the other case, let's say, the students who downgrade their performance in primary school and the students who always have been in the bottom are the ones that actually have the highest risk, of the highest probability of becoming at-risk students. It almost the same happen in math with a small distinction, that is let's say the students who increase their performances, in any case they will have still an important probability of becoming at risk. Which means that in mathematics, for example, if a student that was not a regular student, so that somehow was good before, was bad before and good after, is going to be always a little bit behind than the other students. In any case, it's better to have this level of risk of this level of probability of becoming at risk than to be, let's say, in the bottom of the distribution. And we can see also with the coefficients that the upgrading students is not really significant for the case of mathematics. Okay? We control also for the other characteristics, and what we see, let's say, is the things that are also reported in the literature. So, for example, male students are more propense to become at risk on the reading part, while they decrease the probability of being at risk at mathematics. We also see that performing good at school reduces the probability of becoming at-risk student on the standardized test, but being a student that has a higher variability at the school actually increases the probability of being an at-risk student. Then we look at the, let's say, the environment is important, so of course being in a class with higher socioeconomic status decreases the probability, and then we have the fact that in the south of Italy and in the islands it's more likely to increase the probability of being at risk. I didn't mention it before, but you probably have seen that we are comparing. So we have the model of reading and the model of mathematics. One model have only covariates available at grade 5 for the students to predict the results at grade 8. And the second model, let's say, updates the available information on grade 8. That is mostly, for example, the new grades at the school. If you see, for example, the oral exam grade, always at grade 8 gain relevance because it's more updated than the coefficients at grade 5. But what is, let's say, relevant to see is that in terms of metrics of prediction, it doesn't really change much if you do or try to build a model who analyze the students who are going to be at risk at grade 5 with respect to building it at grade 8. Which means that more or less, with 3 years of anticipations, school principals will be able to identify 8 out of 10 students who are going to be at risk in reading and in mathematics, which means that there's really a large room for potential improvement and interventions within the schools. Then, after this, we actually jump into the second part of the research question. So first we saw that we can promptly identify students that are going to be at risk at the end of primary school. And we saw that the transitions in primary school are significant also towards this identification. So we rather wonder, okay, so which are the factors, for example, associated from the transition of proficiency to non-proficiency and vice versa. If you remember, in the data that we're analyzing, that students at grade 8 on the INVALSI test score of the academic year 2018-2019, we have also the information of grade 5, 2015-16, and so on. If you remember, we have a large portion of the students who are unvarying students, but these students are really too heterogeneous because here we have the top performance and the bottom performance. So we decided to split our analysis to compare the students who improve with regards to the students who always stay at the bottom, and then the students who downgrade their performance with respect to the students that always stay at the top. To do this, we use a model that it was a multinomial mixed effect linear model, where the, let's say, the outcome of this model is a categorical variable that can have 3 possible outcomes. So for the subset of students, for example, that were at the bottom at grade 2, we can have the likelihood of the student of improve a lot their performance, so the upgrading students, the likelihood of the students who reach sufficiency, so improve a bit their performance, and then the students who remain at the bottom of the performance, that is a reference category. And this model, let's say, calculates the logit ratio between, for example, the upgrading students divided by the reference categories, like the students that always remain at the top. And this can be written as a linear combination of students and class level plus a random effect factor annotated at the schools. So what are the results of this model? Of these models, actually, because we run for the top category and the bottom category. There are 4 covariates, actually, that lead the larger effects on increasing the probability of students to improve their performance, or vice versa. The first things that we see, and I'm sorry if it's not so big enough, but if the student at grade 2 had already a good score, they are almost 4 times more likely to improve their performance, which the potential explanation is the kid was already a good student, the professor of the kid noticed it, it just performed badly at the INVALSI test score. But also, if a student actually improved their performance in school, it will be reflected by the INVALSI test score, and he will be more likely to improve its performances. The other factor that was actually the thing that surprised us the most when we were looking at the results is that the peers seems to play a fundamental role for students improving or decreasing their performances. Indeed, if a kid is in a classroom where the peers at grade 2 in primary school are good enough, they're more likely to eventually improve. But more importantly, if the whole class improves their performance, that kid will improve their performance. And as you see, the delta class score, so the difference between the class score at grade 2 and grade 5, is the thing that drives the most, even just descriptively, the improvement or the performance of the kid. It's important to say that this delta class score is calculated net of the value of the student. So we, for each student, compute all the peers' values. This effect is even larger in mathematics. So what we are able to observe is that if a kid is in a class where students, let's say, in the same class, increase their performance, the kid will be 20 times more likely to increase its own performance as well, or becoming, let's say, an upgraded student. Probably, there are several potential explanations for this effect. One is let's say, there is the hidden variable of the teacher quality. So probably the kids that were in a class where they have a really exceptional teacher, then everyone improved. Then is also another potential explanation is how ready were the kids for the test. So maybe it's just a normal class, they didn't have a subject before that was present on the standardized test, and of course you can see an effect after and before without necessarily implying that it's related with the quality of the teacher. But whatever it is, the peers and the thing that is happening within the classroom seems to be really relevant to both increase the performance but also reduce the probability of decrease the performance of the students that are already top performances. Let's say this second part of our research was mostly descriptive, but we can, for example, also see how effective these models are identifying students who increase their performance and decrease their performance. In the case of reading, we can see that it managed to recognize 95% of the students who always remain at the bottom or always remain at the top, and it managed to recognize 1 of every 2 students who make a longitudinal transition. In case of mathematics, the performance are similar, so it recognized around 95% of the students that always remain at the bottom or always remain at the top, and it managed to recognize 6 out of 10 of the students who decrease their performance or increase their performances. In conclusion, we can say that longitudinal changes are significant predictors to identify students at risk at grade 8, especially in reading, and that tracking student performances and changes in the primary school can actually support the identification of a student at risk. Regarding the second research question, we know that both class-level factors, but even more importantly, the change in those factors actually had a significant effect associated with the probability of improving or decreasing kids' performance. In particular, the improvement of peer performances increased the odds of a student in upgrading in math out of 20 times. As I was mentioning before, the teacher quality or whatever is happening within the classrooms is the thing that needs to be investigated further. Indeed, as a policy implication, the class factors that prove to be significant in explaining the students' proficiency development, we will need to identify which are the class characteristics that can improve students' performances. As a limitation, we did not assess or we did not control for, let's say, the emotional development that at least in the literature is associated, for example, to kids' performance, especially increasing or decreasing their performance in time. And also we consider only 2 points to measure the increase or the decrease, but let's say in the standardized test setting is the only thing that we had available. Thank you very much.